the Agile Uprising Podcast. Hello and welcome. We are here for the next installation of the Agile Uprising Agile Manifesto author review. We're very lucky today to be joined by Jim Highsmith. So, Jim, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, and thanks.
This is Ryan Lockard. I will be hosting with my good friend James Gifford, and it would be rude of us not to mention Chris Merman and his involvement in setting this up with Mr. Highsmith. So, Chris, thank you very much for connecting us. Jim, we have spoken to a good number of your Agile Manifesto author cohorts. I think you're either number 11 or 12, so we're well over the middle. And typically, what we like to do is start off with the question of what were you doing prior to 2001? I know that you have a pretty well documented history. I think while we generally don't like going back to the beginning of your professional career, I think there is some merit in just at least tipping a hat towards the first project that you worked on fresh out of school.
Well, the first project I worked on out of school was the Apollo project. And I was an electrical engineer at the time and worked on ships that they were sending out into the ocean to track the spacecraft as it came back from the moon. Because at that point, they didn't have the worldwide communication capability that we have today. And so these ships were full of radars and computers. Back then, we used militarized computers that they were using on nuclear submarines at the time. And so it was sort of the beginning. One of the guys that worked on that particular program or acquisition was one of the guys who then went on to write the Sabre system for American Airlines.
Yeah, I love reading your bio and seeing that the first project that you worked on fresh out of school was literally sending things into space and recovering them. It's a hell of a way to step into industry.
Yeah, when people use the phrase "it's not rocket science," I can reply to that.
Yeah. You and when we spoke with John Kern, it was he was actually working on aerospace, so his rocket science analogies are pretty strong as well.
Yeah.
So. Fast forwarding a little bit beyond that first project, you really made a name for yourself in the world of project management, specifically adaptive project management. Can you speak a little bit to how that came about and what opened your eyes to that more adaptive way of looking at project delivery?
All during the 1980s, I did consulting and training in sort of what structured methodologies of the time. And towards the end of the 1980s, I got to thinking about, I'm teaching people all this stuff, but it's not really the way I work. And so it kind of was a dissonance there. And so in the early 1990s, I had been thinking about this some, and I got a call from a guy who wanted me to do some work on short cycle methodologies because he was selling the automated tool for software development, and they wanted to decrease the time cycles. The guy's name was Sam Bayer, and so what we did is we developed a methodology that we used with companies where we went in for a month and did a project at 1 week iterations. And that kind of got me started on small iterations. Cross-functional teams, a lot of the things that we talk about in Agile today, and that resulted in an article that Sam and I wrote in the early 1990s, 1993 or 94, something like that, on basically rapid development. And so I sort of worked on this all during the 1990s, and at the first I was calling it radical software development. That was kind of my name for it. And when I was writing my first book on adaptive software development, I kept thinking there was a chapter in there, and I knew there was a chapter, but I didn't know what it was. And it was just like, I know there's something there. And finally, I found out about complexity theory and complex adaptive systems. And I started looking into that as a way of really how do you become more adaptable? And that's where adaptive software development came from. And during that period of time, I was working more in the project management arena. I really didn't have much contact with the OO community where XP was sort of getting going. Mm-hmm. I knew about DSDM. I knew about Scrum. I didn't know about XP. And somewhere in late 1999, I ran across Kent Beck. And I called him up and we exchanged our drafts of our book. And we sort of realized we were going on a similar path. His more programming oriented, mine more management oriented. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of struck up a relationship with those folks in the XP community. And about a year before the meeting in Salt Lake City, there was a meeting of XP people in Oregon that Kent Beck put together. It was Kent Beck and Bob and several other people who kind of put that together. And Alistair Coburn and myself were two kind of non-XP people who were invited to this particular meeting, and it lasted a couple of days. And then that sort of was a seed that germinated the meeting later, about a year later, that resulted in the manifesto.
Nice. So I believe you were doing some, prior to 2001, you were doing some work with Alistair as well, correct?
I was doing a little bit of work with Alistair. After several years of living in Salt Lake City, we finally realized we lived in the same city. Yeah. And so we did a little bit of work with Alistair, yes.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Okay, I thought I cut you off there. So Alistair and Kent were your first real introductions to that larger group, and then that Oregon meeting was probably the real catalyst that sprung.
Right. Yeah, that's how I kind of sort of got involved in the group, and then my book was published in late 1999. So my book and Kent's book came out, at about the same time frame, and sort of started things moving forward.
Right. And for those unaware, that the book that you're referring to is the Adaptive Software Development book. Probably one of the first in that space, which was pretty groundbreaking at the time. In that book, I think is that the one where you use the mountain climbing as the analogy?
Correct.
Yeah. Correct. Do you mind just taking a second and giving the elevator pitch of that analogy that you use? I think it's just a beautiful metaphor for how teams can work together.
Right. Well, one of the things that I've tried to do is I've written several different books. I've always tried to bring something different in terms of writing to hold people's interest. So in the project management book, the first go around, I used interviews between two different people. In the Adaptive Software Development book, I used rock climbing and mountaineering because I was doing a lot of that at the time, and really saw, you go into the mountains with a plan of attack on a mountain, but you have to adapt to the conditions continuously. And so that was one of the analogies I used. You go into the mountains with a team. There's a lot of trust. I mean, if you're going to trust somebody with your life, you have this bond that you don't have on typical teams. And so that's an important piece of it too. The other thing that I think is really important is that in mountaineering, you have to understand the mountain that you're trying to climb and your capabilities, and don't mismatch it. That there are mountains that I would never even attempt because I just don't have the skill set. And I think the same way on projects, that in fact there are different kinds of projects. And one of the things that I came up with a little later was what I call the exploration factor of projects, which kind of was like mountaineering in terms of assessing the difficulty of the mountain you have to climb, or assessing the difficulty of the project that you have to do, primarily around the idea of uncertainty. And the more uncertainty it is, the more you don't really understand the technology. It's new technology, the requirements are changing, all of that uncertainty and change. The more of that there is, the higher the exploration factor, and the more you have to be agile or adaptable to tackle that project. And so I use that as an analogy too. And then I also use the analogy of skill sets. That when you go into the mountains, you have climbing skills, you have camping skills, you have weather reading skills. You have, mountain route finding skills. So there's a lot of different skills that you need on the team to climb a big mountain.
Yeah, I appreciate you giving the context there, because I want to remind anyone listening that these thoughts that Jim is talking about were written 17 years ago or 18 years ago now, and they were probably written 19 or 20 years ago and published. But you hear these same thoughts today. People are still taking this basic concept, these concepts that you codified in your book back then, and rolling them out as brand new thought in industry today. So I think it's worth calling that out. I heard an executive. I think the metaphor that I'm hearing now more is the one to the military, specifically the special ops. And instead of giving them a bulleted list of what they need to do to accomplish a mission, they're giving general intent. They're told what the intent of the mission is, and it's up to them to sort out the rest. And it's got a direct lineage to everything you just mentioned about your mountain climbing metaphor. So quite awesome.
It's interesting because I have, at this point, over 50 years in the business. And, ideas do get recycled. And, so you see things that were written the last few years, for example, and they, a lot of the concepts they think might be new, but they really, have grown out of stuff that came up years ago. And even, in fact, some of my stuff comes out of reading things that happened in the 1980s, that things that were on, people who were on kind of the leading edge of looking at things a little bit differently back then. So we kind of, stand on the shoulders of those that came before us is kind of a metaphor.
I'm glad you said that, because I was about to call you out and say, hey, did you take that mountaineering analogy from somebody else? So let's fast track a little bit further, about 2 years now. This is after the Oregon XP gathering. As the 2001, I think it was called the Lightweight Process or the Lightweight Methodologies Conference was being organized. Do you remember who you first heard from as far as the organization that was going into it, who reached out to you, how you heard about it, and essentially how you got invited?
Well, I think it had a direct, it came out directly out of the Oregon meeting. And so I was kind of on the email list at that point for people that had participated in that meeting. And then, there was a more general sort of people were looking at who else should we think about inviting. And so I think that's where mine came from, was out of that other meeting with Kent Beck and some other of the XP folks.
Yeah, I assumed that was going to be the case, but it was worth asking just for the sake of consistency with the others.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but when we interviewed John Kern, who surprisingly was our first interview, he shared with us an artifact that he had stored in his attic. And it was, I believe, Alistair's pre-written notes for the meeting that you guys had in Snowbird. And John had hand markup all throughout it. Do you remember seeing that? It was basically a 2 or 3 page typewritten multi-column Word document that Alistair had made available.
Yeah, at this point, I don't remember it. And of course, as you said, that was 16, 17 years ago now. And so some of the details are a little bit fuzzy. I know Alistair and I got together and talked about it several times because there were a couple of different ideas about where to go. And we finally decided on Snowbird. So Alistair and I put together some of the logistics for that meeting.
Cool. And I'll make sure I get you a copy of it just for nostalgia's sake, so you could put your eyes on it again. We met with Alistair probably 3 months ago now, maybe even more. And he did not necessarily recall it straight away, but as soon as he saw it, it was a beautiful thing just to see his eyes almost pop out of his head. And thankfully that was an in-person interview, so I got to experience it firsthand.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interviews that I listened to. So
Yeah, he's a great guy. He's very accommodating. So as you were local to Salt Lake in 2001, so I don't have to ask if you flew in with anybody. Yours was probably more of a drive. The way that the story's been told is that there was a 3-day conference, but the first night you all had an informal meetup, I believe in the resort lounge, just to shake hands with some of the folks that you had not met prior, and just to kind of get that group forming stage rolling. Does that sound familiar? Is that something that you were a part of?
Yeah, I think it was. And, we kind of get together. I don't remember exactly the details of, some of the different meetings. It's kind of all runs together at this point. I do remember I had ideas at that point for writing my second book, which was Agile Software Development Ecosystems. And it was kind of a survey of all of the Agile methods. And so I used that time actually to interview a couple of the people for that book, as well as the meeting. But yeah, we got together, had some social time, and then, some good meeting time.
So you actually, I think you mentioned this earlier, that going into that meeting, you already had familiarity and some degree of knowledge of DSDM.
I did.
Okay. Yeah, I think in speaking with most of your peers, that was the one outlier that they did not have a breadth of knowledge of going into the meeting. So I was kind of surprised to hear that. But now hearing that you were prepping and probably doing some research for that software development ecosystems book, that might have been one of the reasons.
Yeah, I actually was familiar with DSDM probably for 3 or 4 years before the meeting, because I had just been doing some research for the book that I was writing, the first book that I was writing. So I was aware of some of that stuff that was going on, like Scrum, like DSDM. And I may have been even the person who suggested we invite somebody from DSDM, although I'm not sure that's the case, but I do know that I knew more about it than most of the other people did.
Yeah, and for anybody that's not familiar, DSDM it had more of a foothold in Europe, and Ari van Bennekom at that time was a member of the DSDM consortium, and he was invited. He's one of the co-authors who we've had the privilege of meeting with and interviewing already. So,
yeah, he flew the longest way, probably.
Yeah, he's got the most interesting story too. I don't know if you heard this, but he mentioned in the interview, and it sounds tragic, but he said it lightheartedly, that while he was over, his house burnt down and his wife left him. So, but he said it worked out for the best.
Well, I knew he had to leave early.
Yeah, that could have been on. Yeah. Okay, so I know that quite a bit of time has passed. So hopefully some of the tidbits of the story that I've been fed in the previous interviews can help jog some memories for you. If you could try to mentally go back to the first day, the first morning of the conference, you guys walked into that conference room, and everyone kind of got together, and there was some attempt at a pre-described agenda that quickly evaporated, and you have 17 alpha males all in there talking about their
all who are facilitators at heart, right? So
yes, either inwardly or outwardly facilitating things.
Right.
Do you remember an exercise where almost very quickly the idea of jotting agenda items or thoughts on cards came about, and those cards got tossed onto the table or into the center of the room?
A little bit, I'm not surprised that cards showed up, being as how there were a lot of XP people there. Yeah. And so I don't remember exactly how we came up with the agenda. I do know that the discussion of a name came up fairly early, because Alistair in particular, had some thoughts about not being a lightweights, right? So the title of lightweight methodology had kind of been used by a number of people, but Alistair didn't like being called a lightweight methodologist.
I don't think Alistair took too kindly to be calling a lightweight anything. So,
so anyway, that was one of the early things that we did was look at names, and that was a process that went by fairly good. I think one of the early things we did also was to go around the room and everybody kind of talked a little bit about their particular approach, methodology, whatever it was. And so that took some time, just kind of getting oriented to some of the methods or some of the people that we didn't know. So that was one of the early things we did.
So to unpack that for a second, then obviously you had a pretty good exposure to the XP practices, the XP guys, Alistair, what he was doing, and some of the different methodologies and frameworks based on the research you were doing for your upcoming book. Is there anything that was mentioned that you remember from that roundtable of introductions and just general interest overview that you were not prepared to hear? Maybe not that you objected with, but just something that was like, oh, I never knew that, or this is new information to me.
I don't recall that specifically, but I'm sure as people went through things that I picked up some nuances that I hadn't known about before. I was pretty familiar with XP at that point. I was pretty familiar with what Alistair did. Some of the Scrum stuff I knew about, but that was a little bit new, so I picked up some things there.
Right.
Okay. So I think we all picked up, some of the other stuff, and I guess the thing that's obviously started coming out was the similarities,
right,
and particularly similarities in terms of principles. And that's actually something that I think has withstood the test of time. I mean, there are very few movements, if you will, that have lasted for over 15 years. And I think one of the reasons that the Agile movement has lasted that long is that it's not grounded in practices or processes, but grounded in values and principles. And I think that was new because I had been involved with different kinds of methodologies for the prior 15 years or so. And none of them were really grounded in the kinds of principles that Agile was grounded in.
Yeah, I think it's worth calling out. I mean, I believe it was Mary Poppendieck that took an expressed moment in one of her earlier books to talk about the difference between practices and principles. And by definition, principles are not meant to change. They're meant to be the foundational bedrock that we build the practices on top of. And I think there is something. I mean, I was asked yesterday just about somebody was asking me about the Agile Manifesto because of the work we've been doing with you guys. And the question is are there any of the principles or the values that they would have changed from 2001? And as soon as that question gets asked, the almost immediate knee-jerk reaction is, go read those 4 principles, those value statements, and tell me which one you would change, right?
I know there has been some thought about that over the years of, kind of redoing or version 2 of the Agile Manifesto. And some different people have had different concerns about, one of the values or one of the principles or those kinds of things. And, if somebody wanted to do that, that would be fine. But I don't think any of the original authors are interested in doing that. We sort of did our thing, and it's kind of stood the test of time. And if you redid it, you might change some things here or there. But I think it's been very resilient over quite a period of time now.
Yeah, and I think anything anyone does in the future would be an addendum to, not in replacement of, right?
Right.
So you mentioned the conversation around labeling the efforts. Everyone agreed lightweight was not I assume everyone agreed lightweight was not something that they wanted to brand themselves as. Your name came up in probably more than half the interviews that we had based on your fondness for the term adaptive. So I imagine that was your horse in the race. Is that
right?
Yeah.
And in fact, I think we started out with, 15, 20 different names, something like that we came up with, and it was kind of whittled down. And one of the reasons we didn't go with adaptive was the fact that I already had, kind of claim on that name, and we didn't want to sort of bias it towards anybody's particular methodology.
Right. Yeah, and I think what Alistair relayed as the process for coming up with the name was reductive reasoning. As you said, you put a bunch of names on a flip chart or a whiteboard, and as things were rolled off, they just got scratched off the list, and then you got whittled down to a very small set of options. And it wasn't like somebody was a strong advocate for Agile; it was just one of the last ones standing that nobody had a strong objection to. Does that sound?
I think they didn't have an objection to it, but I would say that there were people who had a little stronger feeling about that Agile was a good name and the right way to go. So I would say that there were some of the, this is something I couldn't deal with versus this is something that, I could deal with. But I think in the end, there were a number of people who really did like the term.
So 17 years removed, how do you feel about the term Agile?
I think it's pretty much stood the test of time. And, so I would still probably come up with the same word again.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really not that many words, agile, adaptive, flexible. There are some words that kind of speak to that. But obviously my two favorites are agile and adaptive.
Right. I imagine if you had to do it again, you probably would toss adaptive out there. And if that got scratched, then lean on agile. So do you remember, other than the term adaptive, do you remember championing something in Snowbird, a thought, a value, a principle, or anything that you were an advocate for, but for whatever reason found the editing room floor?
I think the process that we went through was so collaborative in nature. I think we've long since lost who came up with which words or who liked which principle or who advocated for one and for not the other. I mean, I know we had a lot of back and forth about specific words and about how we framed it. But it was, for me, it was one of the, I've never been in a meeting like that before or since. I'll put it that way.
If we could just pause on that, then what about that meeting made it so unique?
I think the fact that everybody contributed. I think the fact that we had, we evolved a similar set of values that we could all agree on, and that seemed to work pretty well. There weren't any, as I remember it, violent disagreements. There were disagreements, but they were all done to further the process along. And I just felt like, for a group of people, many of whom didn't know each other, to get together, at a single point in time and work together the way we did, I'm not sure what it was. I mean, there was just something in that room. We knew we were working on something that was going to have some legs. I don't think any of us ever imagined it was going to turn out the way it did.
So in that moment, during that time, I mean, looking back now, it's powerful to say I've never worked at anything up to that point that meaningful or that special and since. But at that time, were you aware of the impact and the specialness of that meeting to the degree that you are now?
I think mostly yes. I mean, I think we all left that meeting, really understanding that something special had gone on. So I think there was part of that recognition, even while we were there, that this was a unique happening. And, and like I said, very, very collaborative. And one of the things I know that came up during the meeting, because you could look at that group of people and say, oh, this is a bunch of competitors getting together. And, so you would think that there was some competition going on. And it probably was a little bit. But I think one of the things we came up with is that we all wanted to create a bigger pie so that the pieces of the pie that we would get would still be more than if we didn't do that, right? So we weren't so concerned about competing with each other. We were more concerned about competing with apathy, and the outside world and what else was going on. And we were just, kind of a small cog at that point. And so we were, interested in competing against the other ways of doing more traditional software development, not so much competing amongst ourselves.
Right. One thing that I find interesting about the structure of that event was the way that there were intentional mental hygiene breaks built into the schedule. So you had a morning session, an AM break, a midday session with a PM break, and then an evening session.
Right.
And one thing, it has nothing to do with Agile when I ask these questions, but it's just really good, I think, with the time capsule element of this. Do you happen to recall what you did with those breaks? I know some folks were skiing, some people were hanging in the hot tub. There may have been one or two back at that lounge in the resort.
I know I did some skiing, so that was one of the things that I did because I was quite a skier at that point. So I did some skiing, and I also used that time for at least a couple of interviews that I did with people that was from the next book.
Yeah.
So I used that time a little bit. But it was, the meetings were intense, but we did take breaks. And I think, even on the breaks, some of us would kind of hang out together and get to know each other on a more informal basis. So that a lot of that occurred.
Do you think those breaks added to the progress? I mean, I've been in ever since I started this project with the Agile Uprising group. I've been falling more and more in love with that schedule, that approach to intense, heavy mental lifting type meetings where you build in those breaks. And as you may assume, working in industry, especially large enterprise, you run up against resistance because it looks as wasted time.
Right.
To what degree do you think those breaks actually facilitated the outcome?
Well, I think they did facilitate the outcome. And the other thing that you have to realize about this group of people was that one of our core principles, values, whatever you want to say about it, was this idea of collaboration and cross-functional teams. And so that was something that we really went into it with a common understanding that was really important to us, all of us. And so there were people in the group who really understood team dynamics and that kinds of stuff and were adamant about, the kind of schedule that we had. And I don't think there was anybody who was in that group, at least, who felt like it was a waste of time.
Great. That's awesome. So I think you may have already touched on this answer, but as the event was wrapping and you guys are about to distribute back to your regular professional lives, you had a sense that this thing had some legs to it. Were you at all surprised at how quickly the legs turned into a full-on sprint or even a brush fire?
Yeah, I was. It was. It happened really quickly, and a lot more. Than I kind of thought it would. I thought, everybody in. We kind of felt the same way. We thought it was going to be important, but we weren't. We weren't sure it was going to get the legs that it did so quickly. And I was just looking for something here. But they're fairly quickly. Martin Fowler and I started working on an article that was published the next summer in Software Development Magazine. Okay, and that was one of the first outcomes of the event that was really had to do with publishing, and that was like I say, one of the first things. And I think that article, the fact that Martin in particular had quite a reputation in the industry. The XP people started pushing their stuff more. The Scrum group really got together and started doing the Scrum training, Scrum certification. So it took off a lot faster than we anticipated, and obviously now it's a very widespread movement. But there's still a lot of people doing more traditional waterfall development. It kind of surprises me every now and then. Somebody will call me up and say, we want to do Agile development. What do you recommend? And I say, well, I recommend starting about 10 years ago.
Yeah, you'd be shocked. Yesterday, I was standing in front of a classroom just talking about Lean and Agile principles to a room full of people that it was opening their eyes for the first time. They'd never actually experienced it before. So yeah. It's surprising, but here's the good thing: people are interested still, right?
Yeah, and it's obviously something that in some organizations it's taken hold in the whole organization. In other organizations, it's come a little bit at a time. It just kind of depends on the organization and how big it is and how what their goals are. I mean, the largest organization I've worked with had 25,000 software engineers.
Oh wow!
In China.
What industry?
I've worked with teams that were 4 or 5 people. So.
What industry was that? The one in China?
Telecom.
Okay. Yeah. It's amazing how many of you guys worked with telecoms. It's it's one of the other connective themes or tissue things that runs through all of you. Not all of you, a good chunk of you.
Yeah, well, one of the first. This was in the early 2000s. One of the first companies, or not one of the first, but one of the companies I worked with was in Canada, and they were doing cell phone software. And at the time, cell phones were just coming into their own, and things were changing a lot. Standards were changing. The physical standards were changing. The software standards were changing, and so I worked with this group that was really in the throes of a very difficult software development process, or software development challenge. And there were a number of them who wanted to lock down the requirements, right? And I said, no, you probably better not do that. So there have been some interesting projects along the way.
There's that muscle memory, that organizational muscle memory that as soon as the rubber meets the road, they want to go right back to learned behaviors. But right. I think that kind of speaks to what you were doing straight after the manifesto then. So when you went back into industry, or when you went back into your professional life after 2001, obviously you continued publishing. I mean, you have a heck of a list of titles under your belt. But you were working with large companies and helping them become more adaptive, more agile. Is that what you just started doing? Right. So I actually, during those early years, I was traveling a lot, both in the U.S. and worldwide, and basically doing consulting and training on helping people, like I say, become more agile. Most of mine was more oriented towards project management as opposed to some of the technical practices, but I would typically get somebody else involved with me to help with the technical practices. There is something to that. You mentioned that you traveled worldwide. Is it safe to say that Antarctica is the only continent that you did not run a project on at this point? I didn't see anything expressly about South America, so we might have two.
Well, I haven't worked with client. Well, I've done a little work in South America. I've done a conference in Brazil, and I did a couple of client visits when I was down there. So I didn't actually do a project, but I've worked with some clients down there on a short-term basis. So, all right. So blow my mind. Have you done anything in Antarctica? No. All right. I was going to say you were the first person I think I've ever spoke to then that did all 7 continents. That'd be impressive. But you do. I mean, honestly, it's available on the web. But your bio has U.S., Europe, China, Canada, South Africa, Australia, Japan, India, New Zealand, and that's probably a short list. Yeah, and obviously, I've traveled a lot. I probably haven't traveled nearly as much as, say, Alistair. Of course, he just loves to travel all the time. So I don't think he has an address. No. Yeah, since he left Salt Lake, I'm not sure where his permanent address is anymore. He just kind of rockets around. So I'm traveling a lot less these days. Okay. So then, as we look forward, right? Since 2001, you've obviously had a lot of travel. You've had a lot of publishing that's gone on, and the industry and the industry that you helped build, this agile industry, has turned into one hell of a business. What is for anyone that is just now getting into the agile mindset, and or those that are just coming out, the millennials that are just now entering the workforce, what kind of guidance would you give, or what hopes do you have for the future of agile? Well, I think my hopes for the future of agile have to do with continuing to innovate and do new things and push the boundaries. In the beginning, it was more about delivery. And since then, it's pushed more into project management. And then kind of the Kanban evolution came along. And some people look at Kanban as an alternative to Agile. I look at it as a part of the same movement. It's a little bit different, but a lot of the principles and values of Kanban are the same. So we pushed off into that area. Obviously, over the last 5+ years, the Devops Revolution has come along, and I think that's been a really important piece. So what I see is that Agile has either incorporated or spawned off some of these other things that we continue to innovate in ways to make things better, to reduce cycle times and those kinds of things. Now, we're more recently got it into, bigger projects with Agile, although, some people have been doing bigger projects for a long, long time. It's not new at all.
Right.
Getting more into portfolio management. And then also one of the things we're dealing with a lot these days is organizations in their entirety who want to become more agile, more adaptive, more flexible, whatever you want to say.
Right.
And so from a business standpoint, as opposed to a IT or software delivery standpoint, want to become more agile. And so, you're seeing moves into, sort of business agility. And that's been going on for several years. There's not a generally agreed upon term for the business aspect. I mean, there's Management 3.0, there's adaptive leadership that I've talked about. Other people have talked about other kinds of flexible leadership kinds of things. But I see that idea of collaboration, of short iterations, kinds of things, of looking at goals and measuring value and working closely with customers. Those kinds of ideas have permeated a lot of different places at this point, even outside of software development.
Yeah, I know just recently Mike Beadle has started rolling out his enterprise Scrum framework a little bit more publicly and running some courses in there. And I believe his intent is to do just that, try to have a more honest and transparent conversation about business agility at the enterprise scale. So have you seen anything with what Mike's been doing?
I have not seen that, no. Yeah. My concern is with a lot of the scaling stuff that I've seen, you get delivery teams that are doing pretty good at being agile. And then as you scale up, some of the processes and practices that are put into place kind of harken back to pre-agile days when they were very heavy with process. And so I'm a little bit concerned about that trend.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it. I mean, a framework does not make you agile. It's a complete organizational shift. It's removing yourself from previous behaviors. And if you find frameworks that actually match up nice to your pre-existing behaviors and it just says agile at the top, I don't necessarily know if that's even considered a transformation. It's just a new wallpaper that you have.
Yeah.
So, Jim, I appreciate you spending some time with us today. If anyone is looking to get a hold of you, or if anyone's interested in connecting, how would they go about finding you?
Well, I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I, of course, work now for ThoughtWorks. I've been working for ThoughtWorks for about the last 6 years now, which is remarkably long time frame in my life, but I've really enjoyed it. So we now have, there's now two of us, Martin Fowler and myself, who are Manifesto authors who work for ThoughtWorks. And ThoughtWorks has been doing Agile since way before we called it Agile. So they're one of the leaders in the industry and kind of moving into the Agile space. Very
well-respected company. And you still, is jimhighsmith.com still a good landing space for some folks?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I've got some blogs on there. I haven't been contributing as much to blogs on my own site as to some of the stuff on ThoughtWorks site in the last few years, but you can still get a lot of the basic stuff out of it off my website.
Well, that's great. And Jim, we appreciate having you on, and hopefully we get to talk again soon.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Take care.